In 1982, two friends, Bill Steely and Sid Meier, met at an arcade to play the first-person flight simulator game Red Baron. During this, Sid Meier told his friend that he could program a better game in just a few weeks.
He watched it once and memorized where they put up the bad guys. So he wasn't really playing the game, he was just doing the algorithms. And that's how I scored 65,000 points. He said, Bill, that's not a very good game. I could write a better one in a week. And if he was going to say that, I had to say, if you could, I could sell it.
Although it took him more than a few weeks to program it, Sid Meier ended up releasing his first game, Hellcat Ace, under the developer name Microprose. The game was released for the Commodore 64 in 1983 and IBM PC compatibles in 1984, and was very well received by the public, praising the game for its rewarding gameplay and replayability. This early success would make Sid Meier continue to develop aviation games for the Atari 8-bit computers. Bill Steely's passion for aviation games and Sid Meier's passion for simulation games would make the two continue their shared journey towards improving the genre of aviation and military simulation games that was still at its very early stage. The company would gain recognition for its simulation games such as F-15 Strike Eagle in 1984 and Gunship in 1986. These games provided players with the opportunity to pilot real-world aircraft, giving them a sense of what it might be like to fly military planes in combat. The flight physics, control systems, and real-world military scenarios were designed to be as close to reality as possible, given the hardware constraints of the time. Gunship was particularly notable because it didn't just focus on the action of flying a helicopter. It also introduced strategic elements like managing the crew and responding to mission objectives in a variety of combat scenarios. Unlike simple arcade games, Microprose's aviation sims included well-designed missions with a variety of objectives such as bombing runs, air-to-air combat, and reconnaissance. However, Meier was fascinated by strategy, history, and the dynamics of human civilization, and aviation simulations, while highly engaging, were relatively narrow in scope. Meier was heavily inspired by the board game released in 1986, The Game of Railroads and Robber Barons, and wanted to push this idea for computers. In 1990, Microprose would develop the game Railroads Tycoon, which was a big step in a different direction for the company at the time. Instead of blowing things up, the player would be building and managing by laying tracks, building stations, and scheduling trains. The game would implement a simplified stock market for the player to sell and buy goods, transporting them from A to B, and would be in active competition with other companies controlled by the AI. Sid Meier wanted to continue to develop this idea, but wanted the scope to be broader than just the railroad industry. Inspired by the board games released in 1980, Sid Meier wanted to create something similar for the PC. Bruce Shelley, a then board game designer, felt that the board game market was weakening against the video game market and wanted to recreate this experience for the digital media.
I transitioned out of the board game industry. So I was a graduate student at the University of Virginia and a game club there. A bunch of us started a publishing company to publish role-playing games out of the game club at the University of Virginia. And that wasn't my style of game. I was more interested in complicated board games, war games, and things like that. But that was an introduction to the game industry. I had to travel to trade shows to help move our products, sell our products. So I met other game developers, and then I decided before I got a real job, I would try to make a living in the game industry.
Sid Meier brought him in as a co-designer for Microprose, and together they started development of Sid Meier's Civilization. The game would end up releasing in 1991 and feature a turn-based type gameplay. The player would be able to choose a real historical civilization to start off the game, such as the Aztecs, Mongols, or Romans, but the difference in civilization would purely be cosmetic at this point of the franchise. The game would always start you off with a settler in 4000 BC, and the player would start exploring an unknown map covered in fog of war. As time moves forward in the game, the player will compete with AI players to discover and develop new technologies. Most advances in new civilizations would open up new units to the player as well as new structures. The game could be won in two ways, either by being first to advance the most and winning the space race, or by conquering all other civilizations by force. Civilization received very positive reactions from the public for its unique take on the strategy genre and for its replayability, giving players unique in-game results for each time playing it through. While AI diplomacy wasn't as advanced as in modern games, the game provided interesting interactions with other civilizations. AI leaders had distinct personalities, which gave the player a sense that each civilization was different. However, Civilization also faced criticism for the way it represented different civilizations and their leaders. Some felt that the game reinforced stereotypes about certain cultures, particularly in how the leaders of various civilizations were portrayed. The game's leaders were often represented by a single personality trait or behavior, like some leaders were aggressive while others peaceful. Some felt that the real historical figures had a more complex and multifaceted legacy, yet the game often boiled their leadership down to a simple game mechanic. Civilization would end up selling over 1 million copies, and Sid Meier would quickly start thinking about a sequel. However, this would lead him to a crossroads with Bill Steely, who had more of a passion for military-inspired arcade shooters, such as their first game, Hellcat Ace. Bill Steely would end up selling Microprose to then game developer and publisher Spectrum Holobyte. The deal was part of a strategy to expand the reach and financial resources of the company, which was increasingly important in the growing video game industry. Sid Meier would continue his work towards a sequel for Civilization, now under Spectrum Holobyte, and would end up releasing Sid Meier's Colonization for the DOS, Windows, Amiga, and Macintosh in 1994. Colonization would expand on the successful gameplay elements of the original, but would focus more on one particular historical time. Instead of starting the player off at 4,000 years before Christ, the player would now start at 1492 and lasting until 1850, and would, as the title implies, focus on the European colonization of America. The player can start off the game by playing as either England, France, Spain, or the Netherlands, while the remaining powers would be played by the AI. Instead of a settler, the player would start the game with a ship and 2 units in America. Colonization allows for more freedom to change the unit types at will to best suit the needs that the player may have at a given situation. Where Civilization 1 would focus more on constructing military units, Colonization offers much more variety for the roles that the colonists have. Depending on the land that you choose to build cities on, citizens can function in a large variety of roles such as lumberjacks, gunsmiths, farmers, or distillers. AI will also control various native tribes that the player will come across, and the player will be able to make alliances with them in exchange for goods, or the player can simply take them over with force. Natives are vital to learn certain crafts such as sugar and tobacco farming, and each native city will offer certain specialities to the player. The ultimate goal of colonization is to become independent from Europe, and when the player gains a high enough percentage of Sons of Liberty, they can declare independence. Sons of Liberty also allows the player to choose between real historical figures to join as founding fathers, each with unique benefits for the player. Each historical figure will give the player advantages in certain areas such as military, trade, or religion. Attempting to declare independence will result in a war with the chosen power, and the player will have to defend America from the European royal forces. Like Civ 1, you can understand why those 500-page manuals were popular back in the 90s, because colonization also has a very big learning curve to get through. Reception for Colonization was very positive, and it will sell more than 300,000 copies, as well as receiving awards for being one of the best historical games of its time. It would, however, also be criticized for its depiction of Native Americans. IGN would, in the remake of the game in 2008, write that the very idea of a game about the European colonization of the Americas is both embarrassing and insulting, and that it celebrates a racist doctrine that led to the destruction of numerous native cultures. Other critics would state that the game only features natives as a game mechanic and glosses over the devastating impacts of the European colonization, such as slavery. Defenders of the game would state that the player is free to decide how to play and can be friendly with all tribes encountered and attempt to live amongst them peacefully. It is also important to note the hardware limitations at the time, making it more difficult to truly showcase the historical nuances of the colonization. While modern games have the capability to incorporate branching narratives and morally complex characters, Colonization had to keep things relatively simple in terms of gameplay and story. This meant that significant historical realities like slavery or the dynamics of indigenous displacement could only be represented in very basic and abstract terms, if at all. Some fans of the original were also disappointed that because of the narrow historical time in Colonization, the game did not allow for enough unit types, as you could essentially only have a soldier with a gun and an artillery unit. The freedom to create your own civilization was limited in Colonization, and Microprose wanted to build on the massive success that was the original Civilization. Microprose was uncertain if a sequel to Civilization was even possible if it did not offer some new twist to the genre. However, a sequel to a game that heavily inspired Civilization would change their minds. In 1993, SimCity 2000 was released, the predecessor being one of the major inspirations of the original Civilization. This sequel proved to Microprose that an iterative sequel could in fact work and be successful. Instead of reinventing the wheel, they would attempt to improve on the things that worked well in the original, essentially making the same game but better in every regard. With the development title Civilization 2000 later changed to Civilization 2, Microprose began working towards a real sequel to the original. However, Sid Meier would not be heavily involved in this game. Instead, Brian Reynolds, who previously helped develop Civilization 1, would now step up as lead developer for a sequel. He would state that Sid Meier's involvement in the sequel would basically be brainstorming ideas. Many of the executives at Microprose would state that they thought the improvements were too subtle, and some of them simply thought the game would be a re-release for Windows 95 on the horizon. However, the team felt confident that the changes would be enough to get the fans back in the game, and they were excited to be one of the first big games to be released and optimized for Windows 95. Previous titles had heavily favored a military victory, and the team wanted to balance the game further so that trade and diplomacy was a stronger option, also massively improving the AI capabilities of other nations. The game would release on Windows in 1996 and later on Mac and PlayStation in 1997 and 1999. The game was developed on a modified version of the original engine used in Civ 1 and Colonization, but offered improvements to animations, more details on units, cities and terrain, and an improved user interface. Civ 2 would return to its roots and feature a full historical timeline like the original. It would also feature improvements to almost all aspects of the original, such as more advanced city management that would allow for a wider range of buildings. The improved AI would also make the AI-controlled civilizations feature more complex and diverse decision-making, as they would now sign alliances and treaties, as well as react to how the players act. For example, to be more reluctant to meeting player demands if the player had been hostile towards them or their allies in the past. The technology tree would also feature great improvements, as the player had much more options when choosing which path they wanted to go down when advancing their civilization. It would also feature real-life actors to serve as your in-game counsel and would sometimes summon the player for some interesting cutscenes.
You're sending our soldiers into battle with cap guns and bottle rockets, General. How about some support for our boys up front?
What do you know, Lugnut? Sir, we must maintain our science rate.
The people are all shook up, Your Honor, and need some entertaining to get them unshook.
And sir,
What do you know,
the
Lugnut,
science, the science of
sir?
wealth.
You're
We
sending
must
our
maintain
soldiers
our
into battle with
science
cap
rate.
guns and
Show
bottle
your
rockets, General.
perspicacity.
How about some support for our boys up front?
They would never do this again. Spectrum Holobyte, the owners of Microprose, did however not have much faith in Civilization 2, as they felt the improvements were not enough and that multiplayer should have been a larger part of the game. The public reaction would however say otherwise, as the game would generate a revenue of over $20 million and be one of the highest selling games of its time, proving that even with subtle changes, Civilization still had a large fan base ready to jump back in. It would reach an approval rating of 94% on Metacritic, and PC Gamer would praise it as one of the finest strategy games ever made. The addition of modding to the game was also heavily praised, as it allowed fans to create their own worlds and fictional situations. This success would justify further investment into the Civilization brand, but a new release would prove not to be around the corner, as Microprose and Spectrum Holobyte would struggle heavily with internal conflicts. Spectrum Holobyte was not as passionate for more civilization as the people of Microprose were, and they had many other IPs they wanted to develop. In 1996, Spectrum Holobyte would start to cut significantly in staff at Microprose. Sid Meier, Brian Reynolds, and Jeff Bridges would decide to depart the company too, as they did not feel that Spectrum Holobyte shared their vision. The three would create Firaxis Games to allow them more freedom to create the games that they wanted. However, they would not be allowed to simply take Civilization with them, and conflicts would continue back at Microprose as Evelyn Hill, the board game publisher of the Civilization board game, would sue Microprose in 1997 along with Activision. Evelyn Hill would claim that Microprose has violated its intellectual property, and they believed that they held all rights to the Civilization name, board game or not. Activision, which had been a publishing partner of Microprose for Civilization 2, claimed that they had not received the financial compensation owed from sales. Avalon would end up licensing their rights to the Civilization name to Activision, which ended up releasing their own game called Civilization Call to Power. Microprose was surprisingly not too happy about seeing their game copied by another company and would try to fight this. However, Activision had plenty of money to throw away and likely believed that Microprose would eventually bow down. But the executives left at Microprose were not willing to give up their brand just yet. While all hell was breaking loose over at their former company, Firaxis would continue development towards another sequel for Civilization. However, they could not exactly call it Civilization since there were already a few other companies calling their games this in 1999, but they would instead try to literally take the game to new heights by taking it into space.
Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden. He drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubim, and a flaming sword which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life. The Conclave Bible, Data Links.
Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri would be the so-called spiritual successor to Civilization 2 and would be developed on the Civilization 2 game engine. Instead of real historical civilizations, Alpha Centauri would introduce distinct factions that had very clear goals and differences from one another, such as military factions, environmentalist factions, and scientific factions. These conflicting ideologies would also be a major gameplay element of Alpha Centauri, as the player would have to choose which ideologies to make pacts with and which to eliminate. A UN board would also be added to build on the diplomacy options the previous games had lacked. Here the player could vote for officials or even run themselves to determine the future of the planet. As the game is set in an unknown future, the team could not exactly use unit types from real historical battles and would instead use a modular unit system where the players can freely change certain elements of different units if they have the technology for it. This allowed the player to use their own imagination to build units as they saw fit. Alpha Centauri would, as its predecessors, future victory conditions such as military domination, cultural victory, and asset transcendence victory where the player achieves a profound understanding of the planet. However, it would rely more on scripted events to move the story forward with audio logs and journal entries. Alpha Centauri would receive critical acclaim upon its release and would receive a Metacritic rating of 92% from official reviewers and 85% from users. The game would be praised for its realistic portrayal of planetary conquest and its thought-provoking take on humans going deep into space. However, the game would not reach the same praise and sales, as the game would fail to reach the same heights that Civilization 2 did, even though not many people had much negative to say about the game. So why did the game not do better in sales for all the praise it received? It could be a multitude of factors. It released a year after StarCraft, and it is highly likely that many people did not crave for another strategy game in space so soon after StarCraft released. Many of the core fans of Civilization may have also been turned off by a game not set in real historical times, hence making the remaining fans more of a niche fanbase, as well as the game simply not being allowed to have the Civilization in its title. In the meanwhile, back at Microprose, Avalon Hill had been bought by Hasbro, a leading toy manufacturer that also wanted to get in on the board game and video game market, and they would also end up acquiring Microprose under the name Hasbro Interactive. Because of this, a settlement was able to be made that Activision would stop using the name Civilization in future games, Avalon would stay out of the video game market and hold the rights to the Civilization board game market, and Microprose would be allowed to continue their venture towards more Civilization video games. Sid Meier and his team at Firaxis were allowed to develop the next installment of Civilization under Hasbro, and development towards another game was finally on its way. Once again, however, the team found themselves wondering what they could possibly improve on the game that spanned throughout human history. This job was originally up for Brian Reynolds to figure out, as he had done a pretty good job with Civilization 2, and the team trusted him to once again take the game to new heights. However, he decided that he wanted to start his own company, Big Huge Games, that would also be developing its own turn-based strategy games. This left Sid Meier to look for a new developer lead, as Meier was still too busy with other projects such as Pirates and Railroads. The choice ended up being Jeff Briggs and Søren Johnson, with Briggs being the lead developer. Briggs had been working with Sid Meier since Microprose, while Johnson was a new addition who had just finished an internship with Electronic Arts. With Civilization 3 they wanted different powers to be more unique, and they implemented a certain trait for each civilization included in the game. This would give each power a significant advantage at certain times during the game. For example, Scandinavia would start the game with knowledge of pottery and a warrior code, and have access to a special unit in the Berserker that would be strong in early militaristic expansion as seen with the Vikings, while Germany and America would be stronger in the later game with access to far more advanced military units such as the Panzer tank and F-15 jet. This implementation still gave the player the ability to play their way, but would also need to adapt to their choice of civilization. The game was developed on a custom-made engine developed by Firaxis specifically for Civilization 3. This engine would allow for a more dynamic city border that would expand or shrink as the game progressed. This new engine would also introduce a more advanced tile system where certain areas had access to strategic resources such as oil or horses, and if the city did not have access to these, then certain units or buildings could not be built, even though the player had the research completed. It would also allow for further modding to the game, allowing players to create more advanced custom scenarios for the game. The modding community became one of Civilization 3's greatest strengths, with players creating AI enhancements, custom scenarios and graphical improvements that flourished on dedicated forums for years after the game's release. The game will receive a 92% on Metacritic from official reviewers and 84% from users, and sell about 300,000 copies at release, and will sell about 550,000 copies by 2006, earning a revenue of $21 million, surpassing Civilization 2. The game would also receive some criticism for strange AI behavior at times, being overly aggressive towards the player, starting wars for no apparent reason, which would obviously not happen in real life. There would also be significant performance issues at launch that would only be solved after post-launch patches. These early issues would not stop the game from being popular in years to come though, and 2 expansions would also be released for the game, as Play the World would be released in 2002, which was essentially a multiplayer update for the game, as well as a few new civilizations. This multiplayer edition would not be received well by the public though, as it suffered from game-breaking glitches and was generally very slow. It was named the most disappointing computer game of 2002 by GameStop. The second update would come just a year later in 2003 with the Conquest update, which would also include new civilizations as well as new scenarios and victory conditions. Scenarios would include real-world events for players to jump into, such as the Napoleonic Wars or the rise of the Mongols, allowing the player to control certain civilizations in real-world conflicts and shape history how they see fit. This concludes the first part of the history behind Civilization. In part 2 we'll explore the pivotal shift from Jeff Briggs to Søren Johnson as lead developer and how that would reshape the series moving forward. By the early 2000s, the tech behind the Civilization games was showing its age. At the same time, the rapid evolution of PCs and consoles was unlocking new possibilities in game design, AI and visual fidelity. And with multiplayer becoming a core part of the gaming experience, Civilization was due for a reinvention. Civilization 4 would mark a new beginning. Rather than building on what came before, Søren Johnson approached the game with a clean slate, re-evaluating every system, every mechanic and every assumption that had defined the series so far. From humble tile-based beginnings to the cultural and strategic leaps of Civilization 3, the series had found its identity, but in the years ahead it would find its voice. The next era of Civilization was about to begin.